So, in part two of this discussion of the early whalers, I want to talk a little bit about how Mali enters into this sphere, into this space. As I explained earlier, Mali was a young man, essentially trying to find his way in Kingston. Had always been interested in singing and in music, and according to his mother, was somebody who did sing, but of course was not necessarily a clear cut individual with a path towards a musical career. However, in that same area where he was growing up, in Trenchtown, there were many musicians, and these musicians were young, aspiring artists who had, some of them had made entry into the recording industry, but were also on the street singing in the style of the doo-wop movement, that the doo-wop movement that would really take the United States and especially Motown in waves and dominate the music industry in the United States. And so there were many of these young people who were very interested in music. There was also another interesting phenomena because, of course, as part of the development of the big band period, there was an industry for a sort of, by industry I don't mean in terms of a business, but there was a market really for good musicians, instrumentalists, horn players, guitarists, drummers, and so on. And there was a very specific place in Kingston. Essentially, Alpha Boys School was a home, an approved school for delinquent kids, kids who were thrown out of their homes, they were homeless, and so on. And you could get a place in this Catholic institution, and that institution was very well known for giving students, these young students, vocations, whether it was in carpentry, whether it was in tailoring, and so on and so forth. But it was also very, very, very lively and engaging musical culture, and they had instruments and they could learn musical instruments. So many, as I said, many of the musicians who would emerge out of that would go on to play in big bands and so on. But in the 1960s, late 50s and 60s, they would also form the session musicians for the full recording industry. And out of that alpha movement, we get a band like the Satellites and the Scatterlights. Essentially, the Scatterlights were a band of incredible jazz musicians, gifted jazz musicians, who would produce a series of incredibly brilliant, world recognized jazz albums, but in the ska vein, in the Jamaican ska vein. But they were all instrumental. For the most part, they were instrumental. And one of the great artists of that period was a man called Don Drummond. And Don Drummond was tragic, had a tragic death because, of course, he died in an insane asylum. More tragically, he was responsible for the death of his partner, um, Anita Mofood. He murdered her and went on to be charged and put in prison and died in an insane asylum. But Drummond was a gifted, brilliant trombone player and composer. And he would play on albums that Bob Marley himself was recording on. So Marley is meets a number of artists, and one of the artists that he meets is Jimmy Cliff. Jimmy Cliff, who is still alive and still performing, was about Marley's age, but was well advanced in the music business and had already begun to record. Jimmy Cliff thought Marley had a good voice, and Jimmy Cliff encouraged Marley to go to a studio and an audition to see whether he had any talent. And Bob Marley goes to Beverly Studios, a studio run by a woman called Beverly, Miss Beverly, who owned the studio, and it was a modest studio, and they would record these albums. And at that studio, Bob Marley would record two songs. One would be "Judge Not," which clearly was an original song that Marley probably wrote, and we know this because Marley would reprise that song much later on, 20 years later, um, in one of his in his albums. And so, typically where Marley and the Wailers were covering songs, which they did in the 60s, those didn't repeat themselves in the island years because, of course, copyright issues became more intense. Um, so one of the songs was "Judge Not." Before you judge yourself, and it's a very interesting song. It's a song of admonition. It's a song of correcting people. Before you point your finger at someone else is judging you, right? And it's full of, it's proverbial. It's full of these kind of advocations of the right things, and you can hear Bob Marley's very thin but very energetic voice running through that. But what a great instrumental work that is going on by the musicians. And then the other song that Bob Marley would record was a cover song. And it's a very interesting song because, of course, for many years, very few people would have known that this was a cover song. But it was, in fact, a cover song in the country tradition by a man called Claude Gray. And the song was called "I'll Have a Cup of Coffee and I'll Go." And the lyric is "One cup of coffee and I'll go. And I came to let you know I don't want to cause you sorrow. And I regretting the hurt of it and so on." And of course, it's the song being sung by a 16-year-old covering it. That is really a song of a grown man who has children and all the other kinds of things, and is regretting that he's leaving his wife, his partner. Marley sings these two songs. He sings them well. It's very interesting to hear the Claude Gray's version, which is a very, very sort of early country music style, and then to hear Marley's ska version, which is in that ska version, and you can hear Marley's as early as that. Marley's his great gift, was of course his capacity for phrasing. He had an incredible gift to phrase and to find pockets in a song and to create another dynamic, a kind of sound dynamic in there. Marley's voice in itself was solid in the sense that he had good pitch, and he had a high tenor that could cut through and record very well. But Marley wasn't a crooner. He didn't have a delicate sort of sweet voice, as say somebody like Jimmy Cliff might have had, and many other artists like Dennis Brown and so on. But Marley's gift was the phrasing, the ability to creatively create drama in a song by the way in which he phrased it, where he brought his voice in, where he went around the music, and how he played with the music. A lot of it is influenced by sort of incredible jazz understanding. So this is the early recordings. When Marley was just a guy on his own doing his recordings, it was recorded, it was pressed. It didn't do great well. In fact, his name was misspelled as Bob Marley. Understandable mistake because, of course, in Jamaica, that would have been the pronunciation. So it was spelled Morhley or something like that. But it was the beginning. Marley clearly had decided he's going to be a musician. And so what we get is the legendary story of the meeting of Bob Marley, Peter Tosh, and Bunny Wailer. Bunny Wailer, of course, was not an accidental meeting. Bunny Wailer's father, had become a partner in relationship, sexual partner and relation. They lived together with Bob Marley's mother. So in a sense, Bunny Wailer, who was of course Bunny Livingstone, was essentially Bob Marley's brother. He was his stepbrother. They lived in the same place in the ghetto. But where Bunny Wailer's ambitions were not to be in music. He was planning to go to Howard University, to go to the States, to go to Howard University, to study law if possible, and to sort of have that kind of life. And he had that kind of ambition. We can see that in him. And Marley convinced him to just prolong that just a little bit, to delay that a little bit, so that they could make this attempt at music. So Marley, then the two of them then meet Peter Tosh, and Peter Tosh, as a young man coming out of the country, and who but incredibly gregarious, tall fellow, and had already taught himself how to play the guitar, had already made his own guitar, and really, and with a great baritone voice, a sort of pseudo baritone voice, and they came together and started to sing together. Um, and they were supported by people in the neighborhood. They would be singing on the streets and trying to get harmonies together and so on. So what we have then is Bob Marley, Peter Tosh, and Bonnie Wailer, who would become the original Wailers. They would be joined um, by four other people who at some time it was all seven of them, and then at some times it was five of them or six of them. Junior Brathwaite, Cherry Smith, a woman, Beverly Kelso, another woman, and Constantine Walker, another woman. And they were not like backup singers. They were part of this unit, and they would sing solos, and they would be singing together. And they began to record. Very soon, these wailers, these wailing wailers, began to record in studios. They were taken up by Cox and Dodd, and we begin to see the albums. First of all, the singles beginning to emerge. Simmer Down becomes incredibly popular. Rude Boy becomes incredibly popular, and they really begin to sing these songs. And these songs enter into the dance hall culture and the dance hall world. But they're making no money. They're seeing no money from it because, of course, the business is so geared towards the producer. It's so geared towards those people. And, of course, early Bob Marley and the Wailers begin to realize that there's a problem, but they are also seeing themselves going on stage. They're also looking dapper. They're wearing suits. They're looking like a bunch of artists. They're doing cover songs of Tom Jones. They're doing cover songs of the Beatles. And in the studio, Marley is beginning to learn what it means, first of all, to live in a studio, because he finally leaves home and spends his time in Cox and Dodd's studio, living there, and being just as to sweep the place and so on and so forth. But begins to become interested in production, begins to become interested in working with the session musicians, and becomes very familiar with that music world. The early Wailers then are these really dynamic young people who are making these songs. They're making these innovative songs. They're seen as dangerous. They're not cutie and so on. And the core songs, the core themes of the songs would be either an exploration of youthful anger against authority and against systems, singing songs of admonition, proverbial songs of correction, and love songs. Marley and the Wailers were singing. The Marley was writing a ton of love songs, and these guys were singing. And Marley was always that boy, that young man who is trying to get the woman, and the woman is constantly rejecting him, and he's desperate to get that woman. And there are these lively love songs in the ska rhythm, and then into the rock steady rhythm and so on. But very soon, the entire operation begins to become problematic. Marley Marley eventually um, Marley eventually, his mother moves to America in the mid '60s. Marley's on his own for a stretch. His mother moves to Delaware in the States, and Marley decides that he's going to have to go to the States to make a living, to make some money. Um, and so he quickly gets married to Rita Marley, who he meets, Rita Anderson, who who he meets in Trenchtown just at the time these young men are starting to do their music. She's training to be a nurse. She's also a singer. They meet, and I think she's pregnant when they meet, and Bob Marley vows to look out, not for him, of course. When they meet, she's pregnant, and he vows to look after her child, Sharon, who comes first. And Bob Marley does. When she gives birth to the child, Bob Marley takes on the child as his own. And then they quickly get married. It's a very funny moment because they get married, but the other Wailers did not realize they were getting married. Then Bob Marley leaves. He takes off and goes to the States. So in about 1966, what we have is a situation where this whaling team, these musicians, who are a band that are being very successful, they're putting out a few albums and singles, a lot of singles. they kind of break up because Marley leaves, and it's not an official breakup, but Marley has to leave. They also have a period where Bunny Wailer is arrested and put in jail, and so they're for marijuana, and so they're in this peculiar scattered situation. About a year and a half later, Bob Marley comes back, and we get this earnest period where they start to get some interest from abroad. They get some interest from people who are looking for session musicians. Between 1967 and 1971, Marley goes on tour to some extent. Marley goes to Sweden. In Sweden, he's writing songs for Johnny Nash. He's writing songs for other artists. There are people who are coming to Jamaica and are hearing about his songwriting and so on, and there's an interest. He signs, of course, with a record label in the United States, EMI. They're very interested in it. They do one album, Reggae on Broadway. It is a little popish. It's attempting to corner a U.S. market, and it doesn't take off. Marley's struggling, and that struggle leads to a final tour in 1970-71. It's a rough tour. They're having the hardest time. They're in England. They're traveling around and they're promoting what is their own work because they begin their own record label and they begin to put out a few albums, which are really great because, of course, those albums and those recordings are the basis for Catch a Fire and Burning. Those are the songs that they had already written at that time. But they also discovered that their songs were being released by an outfit that Chris Blackwell, who was then establishing his large enterprise called Island Records, who was a Jamaican, a white Jamaican who was now living in England, had established this Island Records, and of course their songs were being licensed in England and being sold in England. And of course, Bob Marley and the Wailers felt that they were owed money. They confront Chris Blackwell while they're in England at Island Records, and in that confrontation, really, Chris Blackwell concludes that the only way to do this was to give them some money. He gives them about £4,000 and says, "Look, if you will go and put together a record, I would want you on the Island label." Why does Chris Blackwell do that? Well, Chris Blackwell does that because, of course, just before that, his great golden goose, his fantastic artist, Jimmy Cliff, who has exploded in England and there's interest in him in the world, signed with, I think it was Columbia Records. So he loses this guy. And so he sees these three men who he sees as dangerous and different and says, "Look, let me give you this money." And they go back to Jamaica. They use all that money entirely on recording this album, which would be Catch a Fire. Marley then travels to England with the raw recording, and there they work together to produce what we now know to be the first Island record by Bob Marley and the Wailers, which is Catch a Fire. Now, and it's the beginning of a great movement. So we're going to talk in more detail about Catch a Fire. And one of the interesting things you can do is when you listen to Catch a Fire, there's a great deluxe version that allows you to hear what they recorded in Jamaica, and then what happened to it when it went into the sound studios in England when the recording was remixed in England. But I wanted to also make it clear that the bulk of that album had already been written and had already even been recorded and had been released throughout Jamaica, and there were all sort of copies that existed, but they redid those songs in this new sound that was called reggae, a new slower sound and a new sound that would then take the world by storm. So there, at the cusp of the 1970s, we get this new sound. Bob Marley and the Wailers emerge.